All right, hello again, everybody. Welcome back to Airbus 320 Tech Talk. What do all those buttons do? Thanks again for joining me. I'm talking to you from my hotel room in Orlando today. We are going to continue our discussion down the overhead panel. Next topic of business we have to cover should be a pretty quick and simple one today. It is the calls section of the overhead panel here. So we'll pick up our discussion here and talk about each one of these buttons one by one. Right off the bat, just to tell you about the calls panel here, this is specifically has to do with internal communications inside the airplane. So in other words, if there is a time or a need that we need to, from the flight deck, call to an outside station, these buttons are there just to kind of serve as what I think of as sort of like a doorbell. It's just meant to get somebody's attention and say, hey, I need to talk to you. Pick up your phone and let's have a chat, sort of thing. So we'll break them down one by one, what they each do, what they mean, all this kind of stuff. So the first one on the left here, MECH, that is the mechanic call button. So what that is, if we're in the flight deck, or more likely a mechanic is in the flight deck and they need to talk to their buddy outside, they can use this button. And there is a little panel on the outside of the airplane. And where this is located is on the belly, kind of towards the nose section of the aircraft. There's this little, pop open door that will come open. There's a little access panel here, and this is just this little ground servicing panel that exists on the outside of the plane for a couple different reasons. But it's kind of grayed out here, but this is where the headset jack would actually plug into. And if somebody up in the flight deck was using the mechanic call button, when they pressed it, this cockpit call light would illuminate, and there's actually like an aural, like a buzzing noise that would kind of go off to hopefully cue somebody that's kind of standing in the area that once again, hey, I'm trying to get a hold of you, I need to talk to you. Pick up your headset, and at that point you'd be hot mic'd in to one another, and you could talk and accomplish whatever you needed to accomplish. So that is the mechanic call light, call button there. The next one, or the next three actually, or more specifically for when we're needing to call from the flight deck to the aft section of the cabin, or in other words, the flight attendant station. So we have a forward and an aft button and an emergency button. The forward and the aft buttons essentially are used for normal operations. So think of those as kind of like, hey, I need to talk to you, but kind of at your leisure or whenever you get around to it, pick up the phone and we'll start talking. The emergency one, of course, as you'd imagine, is there to more convey a sense of urgency. Maybe we had an unfolding situation up front. We needed to talk to them immediately or get their attention right away. So we have that emergency button there for the explicit purpose, like we said, of communicating just that. So I'll tell you just specifically right out of the book what happens when each of these buttons is pressed. So the forward and the aft buttons here, when pressed, two lights will come on in pink in the related area of the calls panel as applicable. So in other words, there's these little, kind of areas in the front and back of the airplane, obviously, where, take notice next time you board an aircraft. There's a little, phone-looking thing up there. There's a little screen. So that's kind of what this is talking about. So like we said, two pink lights will come on and stay on. And on the attendant indication panel, or in other words, there's like an LCD screen that's up there as well that kind of gives them all sorts of information. There will be a captain call message that appears and a light that comes on in green that alerts them once again that we'd like to talk to them. Of course, you will also hear this high-low chime in the cabin, which you've probably heard this before. It just kind of sounds like a bing-bong type noise there. So I'm sure you're all familiar with that one. And interestingly enough, when you use each of these buttons respectively, the chime itself only goes off in the respective area of the cabin, so forward or aft. And an interesting little sidebar note to tell you here is that sometimes we'll be halfway through the flight, and for whatever reason, all the flight attendants are in the aft of the airplane, doing some sort of service or helping out passengers or whatever, or working together for whatever reason back there. A lot of times, and in fact most of the time, we just use the forward call button to call the lead flight attendant straight off the bat. But sometimes we'll use that forward call button and nobody's picking up, and we just kind of know that, like, hey, maybe they're all in the back of the airplane, so we'll kind of switch back and use the aft position call button there. So just kind of a little assumed thing that you get used to after a while. If they're not picking up right away, is you might try calling them at the different position there, because of course they're moving around during the course of the flight. So just a little bit about the forward and the aft call lights there. So the emergency call button, though, like we said, by contrast, what that specifically does is if you lift up the guarded cage here, and you press the button. 2 pink lights will now flash in the area, or the attendant call area there. The emergency call message will appear on the attendant indication panels, and a high-low chime will sound 3 times on all the loudspeakers in the cabin to get their attention. Like we said, the reason for this is because there's something more urgent that we need to talk to them about. So once again, just to put some real-world context to it, forward and aft buttons here, it's like, hey, I need coffee, or I need a bathroom break, or I need food, and whenever you get around to it, I'm putting the request in to talk to you, and whenever you can get to the phone, come here and pick it up, and we'll communicate. Like we said, emergency, it's like, hey, stop what you're doing, I need to talk to you right now, because something is happening that we all need to communicate about. So that pretty much covers the functionality of the call panel buttons there. Moving on, as I said, we've kind of got a little bit of a Q&A type of thing that I'm trying to do in every episode here. So I had another comment come in from a user that had left a comment previously, and he had another question for me. So once again, Taejun Chang, thanks again for writing in and tuning in. He says, I have a question though. What does vias mean on star charts? I know what transitions are. Isn't transition the waypoint for starting the star, but there are multiple transitions and vice versa for SID? So absolutely right. Great question. What this all boils down to is a matter of phraseology, and there is some technical differences between those 2 terms. So to explain those, first of all, the transitions, you're right, it more has to do with a lateral placement or a starting point of the given procedure that we're talking about. So I've just pulled up, as an example, this is the French 3 RNAV arrival going into Denver. So like you said, you're absolutely right. The transition points are where you start the procedure from. So this is actually going to be part of what you've actually filed in your flight plan, or maybe if at some point in the flight you got a reroute, you would already have this clearance to start the procedure from a given transition point, before you actually arrive over one of these points in space here. So you're right. Transition point, like we said, has to do with a lateral placement of the airplane, but the via is a very important term, and it's important to understand what that means. And this is all part of the future, of air navigation or air traffic control and clearances. A lot of this stuff has been changing in the last couple of years. They've started to issue new clearances in a different way. But when you hear descend via, think V, vertical, via. That has to do with not the lateral track anymore, but actually the vertical track that we're coming or descending down with, or we'll talk about in a second if you're climbing out from an airport area with. So when they say descend via, explicitly what that means is fly your transition routing that you've been assigned, but also comply with all the speeds and the altitudes along the way. So in the real world, the way that this kind of looks is we'll be up at altitude, and the intent of these types of procedures and whatnot that air traffic control is continuing to develop is just that, you're up at altitude, and, in the years past, they would give you like several step downs, several different clearances, a lot of, air time and a lot of words to kind of step you down all the way through the procedure. But now they'll give you a clearance to descend via, and it's pretty much all the way down to like the dump off point where the approach controllers are going to start vectoring you in for the actual approach to the runway kind of thing. So in this case, let's say you're up at 35,000 feet or something coming into the Denver area, and they've told you to descend via the French 3 RNAV arrival. What you're going to do is reach up onto the mode control panel, or the FCU in the case of the Airbus, and you're going to dial in 11,000 feet. And in our case, in the Airbus, we're going to use what's called a managed descent, which basically is telling the airplane that I want you to fly and meet all the altitude restrictions that are programmed into the box, as well as the speed restrictions. The Boeing line calls it VNAV, as do a lot of other aircraft out there. So hopefully that makes sense. That's when you hear this descend via, it's just got to do with speeds and altitudes. So once again, to recap, descend via, comply with all the speeds and altitudes on the arrival. In the same fashion, you'll hear this phraseology also for the SIDs, or the standardized instrument departures, and it means exactly the same thing. It just means, hey, you're cleared, as an example here, out of Denver on this SPAS 4 departure. You have the Joplin transition, for example. So once again, that's a lateral routing. But then they're going to say climb via the SID. And what you're going to do is you're going to dial in the top altitude if you get that clearance. And in this case, it just happens to be for all the departure runways, the top altitude is flight level 230. So you're going to dial in flight level 230 into the FCU. You're going to use a managed climb mode, so telling the airplane to comply with all the speed and altitude restrictions on the departure. And you can just see, depending on whichever routing you're going out of the airport with, I mean, you have all these restrictions, so let's say you're heading out this way, Burkham below 10,000 feet, Nimbus, Len, max 280 knots above 10,000 feet, et cetera, et cetera. So same kind of concept. It's just, like I said, a more streamlined and kind of the future, way that air traffic control is issuing clearances and what have you. Hopefully that all makes sense, Tejan. If you have any more questions, don't be shy. We'll follow up and answer them for you. So, and for all you guys out there watching, if you have any other questions about any other things that we're talking about here, or even anything we haven't covered yet, feel free to write in and leave a comment, and we'll tackle them as able. And for all you guys out there too, I like how this channel, it's kind of becoming like a little bit of a community for, it seems like a lot of the viewers are out there, kind of at the learning level, and maybe you're stepping through your flight training. So by all means, use me and use this as a resource if you have questions as you're kind of coming through the pipeline. I'm more than happy to talk about it, and hopefully we can all serve to motivate you to keep moving towards your goals and getting to where you want to be with your aviation careers. So once again, guys, appreciate you tuning in. We'll talk to you later, and I hope you all have a great day. All right.